This is a special presentation of Farm Journal Television.
Today's farmers have high-tech equipment, from tractors to GPS to the hybrids, fighting for every bushel. Here to help is agronomist Ken Ferry.
There's definitely some things we put into our systems pyramid.
And agronomist Missy Bauer.
So we're trying to create that true V-trench.
And they're using the systems approach to higher yields on every acre. I'm Clinton Griffiths, and she's Margie Fisher. Together, we're Corn College TV.
Corn College TV, brought to you by Winfield, uncovering insights through data to help farmers be greater. Visit your local retailer or learn more at winfield.com. And by Micro Essentials, the next generation of fertilizer for the next generation of farming.
Thanks for joining us on Corn College TV. Today, as part of the systems approach, we're going to discuss soil testing. And as always, Missy Bauer's here to help us through that. Missy, let's talk about the basics of soil testing and why do we do it?
The reason we pull these soil tests out in the field is to really give an indication of what's happening in the field as far as our levels. Where's our pH at? Where's our phosphorus? Where's our potassium levels at? So we know how to make better decisions and make sure fertility is not a yield limiting factor.
Sure, and we take that information and we start to build a map.
That's correct. We want to start with what we call management zones, which we'll talk about more in a minute, but developing management zones, pulling those samples based on the different soil types that are out there amongst the management zones. We send that into the lab, get it back, and now we say, what do we do with the data? Now
Sure.
We've got to make the recommendations to make it real so we know what to actually apply out in this field itself.
Okay.
Then we'll also want to look at things like tissue sampling. You know, it's a good way to kind of follow up my soil testing program as a kind of a helping or an aid in that to really fine tune it even more. And then maybe one people don't normally think about is actually nitrate testing. So it's a different type of soil sample. We pull it a little bit deeper, but it gives us an indication of what's happening with the nitrogen in the soil at any given time.
Sure. So after we've done the testing and we've got this information, where do we go from here?
Where do we go from there is really trying to make the actual recommendations and get into that aspect of it.
Okay, so walk us through some of that. You've got some examples.
Let's start off with the management zones. When we want to build management zones, how do we do that? That's a common question we get by farmers. So maybe we'll start off and say, what is a management zone? A management zone is trying to capture the differences or the variability in the field. So we've got some soil types out here that maybe have high organic matter, high exchange capacity, as we can see in this example here. It's a little darker in color, versus other parts in the field are lighter soils, more sand in them, low organic matters, lower CCs. So a management zone is literally what I call kind of squiggly lines out in the field as far as capturing these soil types. So I've got a darker soil here versus a lighter soil here. As you can see in all these different samples, differences in color and type. These soils are going to hold nutrients differently. So I want to capture that soil type as a first part of building my management zones. So sometimes we can use our county soil surveys as a way to do this. As a reference starting place. Other times it's visually what we see in the field. When we go out to this field, you can visually see the differences in the soil, and it actually changes with elevation. So sometimes your low ground will be different soils than maybe what your high hilltops are like. Okay. So that's one thing to look at there as well.
And it's hard to do it just with the soil testing, right? Like pulling those samples. It's not always the easiest to say, okay, I pulled this is what this whole area is. It goes a little bit deeper into that.
Right. One thing that the deeper into it is utilizing maybe our yield data. So what we see a lot of times is, here's an example of a yield map. This dark green is where this field yields really, really well versus some of the areas where it doesn't yield as well here in the yellow. What you can see in this example here, which is of that field, is that here's this dark soil type. This dark soil type is the one that's yielding so well versus up in here where it doesn't yield quite as well. So now we can start to utilize yield maps to help create our management zones as well. So in addition to what we see with soils, we utilize the yield data as well in creating these.
And what's the grid here? What does this represent for us?
What this is representing is just the difference between management zones versus a grid or grid sampling. So a lot of times a grid sampling, you might come out here, it has a potential of actually blending these different soil types together. Where a management zone draws this line in here to actually make sure we're keeping this soil separate from this soil.
Sure.
So we know that these two soils respond differently in the amount of nutrients they hold, as well as their yielding capabilities. So that's the idea of the management zone, is to try to capture this variability out in the field and then manage it therefore.
Okay, so we're using soil tests, we're using yield maps. NDVI, is that something that is useful in building these?
Correct. So an NDVI, or an aerial image of basically a vegetation map in season, is another good thing that we can utilize to help determine where these zones should be and kind of how do I draw these zones out? You know, where should all my squiggly lines be? That's the idea behind it. Right. So utilize as many resources as we can helps us create better management zones that we can actually use in the field.
Corn College TV, brought to you by Avail Phosphorus Fertilizer Enhancer. Supercharge your phosphorus this fall with Avail to maximize the use of your fertilizer investment in the spring.
There are 406 million acres of cropland in the U.S. Winfield is helping to make them work harder. Maybe the answer isn't a new product, but a new way of thinking. A way to turn data into something you can harvest, driving efficiency into every molecule. It's time to rethink what a business partner can be. It's time to be greater. Winfield.
Supercharge your P with Avail Phosphorus Fertilizer Enhancer. Studies show that when you add Avail to your fall-applied phosphorus, you can see an average increase of 9.9 bushels of corn per acre. Avail reduces phosphorus fixation to promote more efficient P uptake to the crop for stronger roots, better overall plant health, and higher yield. Supercharge your P this fall with Avail Phosphorus Fertilizer Enhancer to maximize the use of your fertilizer investment in the spring. Ask your fertilizer dealer for details today.
Soil sampling is the foundation of your fertility program, and we want to make sure that when we're pulling soil samples for our soil tests, that we're doing that about every 2 years in your fields. That helps us keep pretty consistent on keeping up with the lime needs or the pH levels in the field, as well as your overall P and K levels or micronutrients in these fields. It's pretty important when we pull soil samples that we do it in a very proper way. One thing that we want to keep in mind is the depth that you're pulling the sample at. And that's going to be depending on which lab you're using. So it's going to be calibrated to the lab that you're going to send your samples into. Some labs are around 6 2/3 inches deep. Other labs maybe are 8 inches deep. So double check with your lab on what your depth should be. One of the important things is that the depth is very consistent. So the lab that we use is at 6 2/3. When I go to pull my core, I want to scrape the residue out of the way so I'm not getting residue in the sample. Then I'm going to go ahead and take my core, I pull up my probe here, and then I'm going to actually check the depth. And what we do on our probes is we have these marked. So this is marked at that 6 2/3 depth. You can see here I'm just a little deep, so what I'll do is I'll slide this down and I'll break off the end so it's flush. So now that's a consistent depth, and then I go ahead and put that into my little sample bucket here. But the consistency of depth becomes really, really important. One of the other things that we want to keep in mind as we're pulling these, per sample or per management zone, you're going to pull about 10 to 12 of these cores throughout that zone. So as we go and do it randomly within that, we'll pull those. The other thing that we want to keep in mind is actually pulling these cores within the same soil types or management zones. We'll take a look and be able to show the zone map for this field that we have here, but part of what we're doing is the low ground that we see here is a little darker in color versus up on the high hill. We can see that of these cores that I pulled here earlier, the differences in the color. So here's the low ground. You can see it's a much different darker soil type, more organic matter, higher exchange capacity than what I have up on the hill. So as I'm pulling my soil samples, I want to make sure that I'm not blending these together. I'm keeping these separate in separate bags. And what I have set up on my four-wheeler here is different bag for each management zone that's out here. So as I go pull my cores, I make sure they get in the proper bag. In order to know where you're at in the field, we're using field computers and GPS. So this GPS shows us the cursor of where we're at in conjunction with this actual zone map that's on here. So for example, I know when I'm in this management zone here versus when I cross into a new management zone where that soil type changes. So very important, get your foundation of your soil fertility program is going to be through soil testing and pulling these samples, but we want to make sure we pull them accurately and in the proper management zones out in the field.
Corn College TV is sponsored by the Enlist Weed Control System from Dow AgroSciences, a new herbicide and trait system that will build on glyphosate.
used to be, you go plant the crops, then you go out, hook up the cultivator and cultivate twice, and it was a lot more labor intensive, and our operation was about a third of the size then. When Roundup technology first came out, that was the biggest thing that has changed things. It really has allowed for the expansion in acres and size too. It's just been a huge advantage. I think it would be a huge loss. It would not only be lack of convenience, but just the peace of mind of knowing that if you do have a problem out there, that you can solve the problem. It would just be nice to have another tool in your toolbox to attack weeds as you need them.
All right, Ken, so we've done our soil test. We've got all that information back, a bunch of numbers. Now what do we do with it?
Well, and of course we used all our tools to figure out how we need to zone this field, so we're sampling the field as accurate as we can. Then we're going to take that information that we've collected, whether it be pH, phosphorus, potassium, mineralizable in, and we're going to make a nutrient plan on it. So we know now what the soil's got, what we think it can supply. We got to make up that difference. So we're going to turn around and write a prescription. But it's different than the prescriptions of years ago. Now we can farm this thing by the foot. So we're going to make a prescription, for instance, for nitrogen that's going to change throughout the field. It's going to take into consideration the supply power and the loss risk of that field, and we're going to try to make a variable rate nitrogen map to meet that. From a pH perspective, we don't have to spread the whole field. We can only spread the areas of the field that need to be balanced, so we don't have pH swinging one way or the other. And if we want to build, push, or pull from a fertility perspective, we can build a variable rate map. So our P and K are in this plateau, our pH over here, our nitrogen values there. And we can do the same thing with our plant densities as far as trying to figure out how thick to plant the field. So we know from the soil test how heavy the soil is, what its water holding capacity is, and we can flex our populations up and down through that field to take advantage of the high water holding capacities on parts of the field and the light. So the soil test is kind of the foundation to make all these prescriptions or decisions that we can make, and then we just got to build the maps that all these applicators can understand, and we go to the field.
Is this something that we adjust yearly or every other year, or how do we go about doing this, and what kind of rotation should we be
Kind of depends a little bit on your testing rotation. For instance, we test every 2 years, so yeah, we're rebuilding the base apply maps about every 2 years when it comes to fertility. When we talk about plant densities, they pretty much stay the same, the light soils and the heavy soils, so you don't change them much. So you have to come up with a plant population that you want to work with. Now you may tweak them up and down depending on genetics, but they would stay somewhat the same. But the rest of these maps would change every time that field is sampled to reflect the differences in the movement that you'd have out there itself.
Okay.
Early season tissue testing can be an important part of our fertility program. There's a few things we want to keep in mind if we are going to pull some early season samples. Number one is we're pulling what we'd call a whole plant sample. In other words, we're taking the entire plant from the surface of the soil up and collecting it to be able to send into the lab. When we do these whole plant samples, we're usually targeting smaller corn, usually around a foot tall or less. So once the plants get a lot bigger and around a foot tall, maybe a little bit more, then whole plant samples get to be a little bit too much. So we're targeting this V4 to V6 corn or 4 to 6 collar corn. When we go out to the field that we want to do the tissue sampling in, we're going to collect random plants, again from the top of the surface up, and usually we want to get about 15 plants collected. So we'll just come through here, grab the plants, and I just kind of twist them off. When they're small like this, they'll break right off at the surface of the soil. And we just collect several of these scattered out in the different areas that we want to take the sample from. Once we got them all collected, I just kind of fold them over like I have here and put them into a paper bag. It is important that they go into a paper bag so that we don't condense moisture like we would out of a plastic bag, and then it'd be ready to be sent into the lab. So doing some early season tissue testing along with some other things as far as soil testing and late season tissues can really help have a big impact on your fertility program.
Still ahead, Missy Bauer takes a look at the health of your soil. But up next, Ken Ferry talks about water filtration.
Over the generations, fertilizer, the unsung hero of the farm, has been in the background, quietly nourishing crops with very little fanfare. Until now. Meet the next generation of fertilizer. Micro Essentials.
An important aspect of water management is understanding water infiltration. Ken, we have an example here in the field. Tell me the steps. What are we learning?
Well, what we're trying to gauge is what is the infiltration rate. One of the tricks to managing how much water we got available for our plant density is how much can we get in the soil. So what we're looking at here is measuring the infiltration rate. So we've driven this ring in the ground about 3.5 inches, and we didn't disturb the soil inside here, so we can see how the natural structure takes in water.
Okay.
Then we would put something like this over here.
Just some plastic wrap.
Just some plastic wrap, and I'm going to add the equivalent of 1 inch of water to this cylinder. And then we're going to slowly pull this out of here, let that water kind of lay in place.
Okay.
And then we're going to
time it. So it's not a fast pour, it's just a real natural.
We just don't pour it in there and disturb the surface. I want the natural surface that would be here. And then we're going to time it. We're going to see how long it takes for this water to disappear. When that soil just has a glistening to it, then you'd stop your watch and you know how many inches per hour the infiltration rate is on the soil itself.
So you just do a calculation and it helps you gauge how much actual water your field can take in.
Right, so our coarse sands, of course, it would go in right away. Our silty clay loams, it'll go in pretty good. This is a silt loam situation, and it's going to be quite a bit slower. The slower the water goes in, then the less of each rain that I get, and it changes how we would manage things like plant density. It also changes how we'd manage nitrogen, because the slower nitrogen goes in, the less risk we have of leaching or denitrifying in those soils.
So this is more of a study in what our soils can do for us rather than anything we're doing to our soil.
Well, not necessarily. If you're working to improve soil surface structure through things like cover crops and stuff like that, you should be able to improve this over time. So the healthier your soil is, the quicker the water would move in, the better your infiltration rate. So it is a gauge, if you want to think of it as, is my soil getting better over time? If you were to do this on a routine basis to check it out, is my cover crop improving my situation, or is my tillage practices, for instance, decreasing that?
Ken, so we do the water infiltration test, but what can we learn from that?
Well, just as we go out and do the test, we sometimes can find a soil that has a high infiltration rate on one farm, and the same soil type has a poor infiltration rate on the other, and that's an indicator of health. And what that's indicating is we may have poor aggregate stability. So we can take it a step further now, we can look at the overall aggregate stability. Instead of just working at the surface now, we're going to take the soil from the top 6 inches and we're going to mix that up, and then we're going to screen it out to be under 2 millimeter in size crumb structure. And we're going to take these aggregates then and we're going to put them under a rain simulator. And if they're good, strong aggregates, a lot of the soil will stay above this screen that we have them on, and it'll stay together. But if they're poor soil aggregates, then the soil will break apart and the silt and the clay will fall through the screen. And that's the same thing that happens after a big rain. They seal up and the water runs off. So if we have poor aggregate stability for our soil type, then we have to start thinking about things like grass crops as far as rye and cover crops that would bring that structure back. We can't get structure back from a soybean. Corn is okay, but your cover crops are better. So we're going to take a look at a healthy soil and a sick soil. They're both the same soil, but at the same time, one of them is a lot tougher shaped than other, and the rain simulator will show that for us.
Sure, so describe the samples that we have here.
Okay, we've got 25 grams of soil that we pre-sifted through a 2 millimeter screen. We're going to start out with the weaker soil. It's one that runs together and water runs off. So if this was your farm and you got an inch of rain, water would be running out of it. If this was your neighbor, he would be saturating or taking that water up. And we're going to do that here with the rain simulator. We're going to set this sample down here, and through the vacuum tubes, this simulates a rainfall. We got the same size water droplets. We're just going to give it a little push to simulate rain, and then we would let that run on there. In this case, we're raining at about 6 inches an hour, and we're only going to do this for about 5 minutes. So as we splash water down on the screen, how much of those soil aggregates come apart and how much of the fine material falls through.
So can we let this run for the duration of the test, and what do we see?
Well, we're taking a look at what aggregates were successful and stayed on top of the screen. We notice that if we look in here, it's a lot of organic matter, but there's very little aggregate stability. It's more of a kind of a slime in there as far as this soil failed. It had poor structure, and structure allowed it to fail together. So this is going to be a soil that seals up for us.
Time to pull that sample. And what do we see there?
These samples have had the same treatment, the same amount of water. But this healthy soil has good, strong aggregate structure. We can see the individual aggregates still here, and a high percentage of it, probably 80% of it, is still here. It's on top. While we can work with things like plant density and stuff to adjust to the water we have, we can work on soil aggregate health to improve the water that we have out there.
If farmers want to know about their aggregate stability, what might be a good resource for them?
There's a number of health labs now that are showing up around the country, so they could ship their sample off to a soil lab and have it analyzed for aggregate stability. They can do what's called a simple slake test, where they do similar to what we did here, or they could use a range similar like this, but not many farmers would have this, but maybe the extension office would, or the local university would. Probably the easiest is to find a soil health testing lab and just ship them a sample and ask them to look at aggregate stability.
Thank you, Ken.
Don't wait to get started on your new farm building. Call today and take advantage of discount pricing during our off-peak construction season sale. Building spots are limited, so contact your local sales office or visit our website.
Hey, what's going on?
Just checking the fields. Yours are looking pretty good. Must be doing something right.
Actually, I got a guy.
You got a guy?
Well, it's not just any guy. I got a Channel seedsman.
Channel, yeah?
Yeah, I've been working with him pretty close to get, well, you can see for yourself. This is what I'd recommend. Let's get to work. Now this is what you want to see.
Maybe I should get a guy.
Maybe you should get a Channel seedsman.
Find your Channel seedsman at channel.com.
It's time to demand more. With Micro Essentials, you get more from every acre. Through our fusion technology, only Micro Essentials combines 4 vital nutrients into one powerful granule, ensuring uniform nutrient distribution and increased nutrient uptake. The innovation behind our fusion technology means you'll grow stronger, healthier plants. Micro Essentials. Get more from every acre.
Several things we can do to try to improve our soil health. One of them is understanding proper drainage. So if we have good drainage in our soil where we don't get saturated, waterlogged conditions, we'll have better microbial activity in the soil itself, less issues with things like denitrification where we could lose nitrogen. So proper drainage is one. Another is just looking at the aggregates themselves where we have good aggregate stability and where we're not destroying soil structure. So often soil structure can be destroyed by things like poor tillage, in being on the soils when they're too wet. So anything where we're compacting or compressing those soil aggregates themselves will start to destroy that structure. We lose some of that good crumb structure, and then we'll start to have more issues with the compactability as well as just good root growth in that soil. One of the other things to think about is actually soil pH. So you might not think about that in relating to soil health, but that relates to the liveliness of our soil. So if our pH gets too low, it really hurts that microbial populations in the soil begin to crash and the soil's not, quote, as alive. So keeping that pH in line as well as the drainage and understanding where we're at with tillage and reducing compaction all goes into having a good, healthy soil.